Truth Unveiled here, and today I have so much information to share with you because as you have been seeing, there has been so much stuff that has been going on this past week, and it's important that you see everything and see the bigger agenda behind all this, and so that you can see exactly what's to come and what's on the horizon for America. But yes, America is in an uproar, literally, because I'm here at WND and it says Black Lives Matter launches Weekend of Rage, and we're going to see exactly how they've been doing that because we're going to be talking today about all of the protests and the riots, but we're also going to be talking about the military interventions as well as how the government's responding to all this and Mr. Obama as well. But it goes on to say that demonstrations to denounce the fatal shooting of two black men by police officers this week exploded across the nation in what the group Black Lives Matter called a weekend of rage, following the surfacing of video showing two African American men, Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, who were shot by police in Louisiana and Minnesota respectively. 5 Dallas police officers were gunned down and 7 others wounded during a demonstration Thursday evening. But neither that tragedy nor growing tensions between the police and blacks was enough to quiet the protests. And later on, I'm going to be doing a subsequent video where I'm going to be exposing the truth about these shootings, about these alleged shootings, so that you can see the whole truth and nothing but the truth. Because remember, never believe a word that your mainstream media is telling you. Never buy into the hype because it's all lies. Now, the article goes on to talk about all of the different protests that have been going on nationwide. And as you can see, the protests are only upticking. It's only getting worse from here. But it goes on to say that the major protests took place in many major cities, including Atlanta, New York City, Rochester, Phoenix, Baltimore, Baton Rouge, Chicago, Denver, Detroit, Nashville, San Francisco, Seattle, St. Paul, and Washington, D.C. So all of these major cities are experiencing different protests and riots as we've been seeing, and it's even ongoing in some of these cities as well. So we already see the different agendas and tactics that the mainstream media is trying to do, as well as what the Zionists and the elite are pushing, because they're trying to trigger this race war any single way they can. But in order to do that, they need you to be riled up, and they need you to be in arms, and they need you to be protesting in order for this race war to really start. Because remember, it's all about divide and conquer. That is the bigger agenda. Rome all over again, white versus black. This group against that group against this group. It's the same darn agenda, divide and conquer. But it goes on to talk about all of the nationwide protests. And as you can see, the protests in Atlanta had the largest demonstration where an estimated 2,000 protesters chanted, waved signs demanding justice, and blocked part of Interstate 75 and 85 in a tense standoff with police. So we also see the bigger agenda where what people are turning against law enforcement, and that's exactly what the elite want. But it goes on to say how there have been protests in Baltimore where about 200 people gathered in protest to march from McKeldin Square to the Baltimore police headquarters. And then of course there were definitely protests in Baton Rouge too as well, where there were about 300 protesters in Baton Rouge that started off peacefully but descended into chaos after several protesters hurled plastic bottles of water and cups of ice at the police. And many officers were attired in riot gear, and people could be heard chanting obscenities at the different police that were there and trying to fight them off. But we also saw demonstrations in Phoenix that also turned violent when protesters threw rocks and other objects at law enforcement officers during an anti-police brutality rally back on Friday evening. And the agitators even shouted that we could shoot you to the different officers who were there. Now, there were an estimated 1,000 participants who participated in the riots and the protests in Phoenix, Arizona, and not to mention how there were different roads and ramps that were also closed due to the law enforcement activity in Arizona as well. But there were also different protests and riots that occurred in both Rochester and New York City as well that took place. And of course, we see protesters taking the street, and many of the roads and streets were closed and blocked off as well. But even in Rochester, there were 74 arrests that that were made for what they call and consider disorderly conduct, and even 2 charges of resisting arrest. Why am I talking about all of this? Is because what's the bigger agenda once again? What? Staged race wars, staged race riots, because they're getting ready for martial law. And how do I know they're getting ready for martial law? Well, to be quite honest with you, martial law has already been here. Just look at Abraham Lincoln, who signed it into executive order. But let's keep going, because what? They're bringing in law enforcement, and they're bringing in more law enforcement, as we see, because it even says nationwide law enforcement officers are on high alert. In many locations, they are being ordered to partner up for assignments, wear bulletproof vests, and not to respond to calls alone. And so what that means, more chaos, order out of chaos, Phoenix rising out of the ashes. Does that sound familiar? But it even goes on to say how the Washington Post noted that police commanders nationwide began pondering Friday not only the significance of the tragedy in Dallas, but whether they need to reconsider how they do their jobs in a more highly charged environment when viral video and angry rhetoric can quickly ignite anti-police sentiment. Because there's something your government is not telling you, and we're going to be talking more about that in a second to come. And there's a reason that these riots are going on and that this agenda is upticking the way it is, and there's a reason that you're seeing more of these things happen in America at such a time as this. Is this part of the Summer of Chaos agenda? Of course it is, but it goes on to say, and I thought this was very interesting and suspicious indeed, when Washington Police Chief Kathy L. Lanier said that she gave the order to partner up at about midnight, hours after the attack in Dallas killed 5 officers and wounded 7 others. At least that's what they're telling us. Remember, never believe a word mainstream media tells you. She conceded, looking at the type of attack that happened in Dallas. A 2-man car, a 4-man car, 10-man car isn't going to make much of a difference, but it makes the officers feel much safer. These orders were echoed in places like Boston, Las Vegas, St. Louis, and other urban areas. Why urban areas? Let's keep going. St. Louis Police Chief Sam Dotson gave orders to his officers, adding, although locally we are not experiencing any civil unrest, this decision is precautionary and is to maximize the safety of officers and our community. Interesting that he would even mention the word civil unrest, because isn't that what your government's planning for? Isn't that what your military's planning for? Isn't that the purpose of those Jade Helm and UX drills? Is it starting to make sense now? Do you see the bigger agenda behind all this? Do you see the divide and conquer agenda and how they're trying to stage all these things so that they can declare martial law in America and bring in the military, who will then take out not only you and your family, but also law enforcement as well, because that's exactly what they're doing. Why do you think you've been seeing all these UN trucks all over the place like no other? Because that is what they're getting ready for, not to mention all of these military tanks as well. It's time you see exactly what's going on, because mainstream media is trying to push your buttons any single way they can, and please do not let them. Please do not buy into the bigger agenda, because when you start to wake up to exactly who's behind all this and who's really funding all this, courtesy the Zionists and the Council on Foreign Relations and the Rothschilds and the Rockefellers and all those elite terrorists who are on the top, when you start to wake up and see that it's the Zionists who are doing all this along with George Soros, then you start to understand the bigger agenda and how it's all one great big mental psyop. That's all it is. Now, the picture that you're looking at right now, as you can see, the man on the left right here is Alton Sterling right here, and this is Philando Castile. Now, the reason I'm showing you this is because these were the alleged victims that took place in the shootings, and in my subsequent video, I'm going to talk more about those videos that came out that are surfacing online and that have gone very viral, because when you start to look at these videos clearly, you start to realize that there's something bigger going on. It's all one great big mental psyop, and you're going to see what I'm talking about. Just stay tuned for my video, because that should be uploaded in a few hours from now. Anytime mainstream media is pushing an agenda, anytime mainstream media is pushing an official story like the 9/11 and the Sandy hoax, anytime mainstream media is pushing anything, you know to question it, because we know darn well it's all staged and orchestrated ahead of time, pre-planned, pre-funded, and pre-staged ahead of time, because they're good at lying. That's what they get paid to do. Because I'm here at CNN and it says hundreds arrested in protests over shootings by police, and it goes on to say, now we already talked about much of this, about the confrontation that's been going on in many different cities across the nation with all of the protests and the riots that are going on, but I wanted to turn your attention here where it says, and this is according to them, it says at at least 309 people have been arrested over the weekend in New York and Chicago, and in St. Paul, Minnesota, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where two black men, Philandro Castile and Alton Sterling, were shot to death by police. At least that's what they're telling us. The killings have sparked several days of protests, and whether or not these were orchestrated or not, we know darn well that this actually does go on throughout different neighborhoods, throughout different urbanized so-called black neighborhoods. You know that this type of stuff goes on every single day because there's a lot mainstream media is not telling you. There's a lot that your local news stations and your local news reports aren't telling you every single day, because these types of things do go on in urbanized neighborhoods where the law enforcement and police officers are shooting and killing so-called black people and getting away with it with no documented evidence on it. Just look at Sandra Bland. Why is that the case? Because there's a bigger agenda behind all of this, and it's time you see just what that agenda really is. Now, I would also like to go over with you what's been going on in Dallas these past couple of days, because here I am at the Huffington Post, and it says from the headline, "Sniper attack leaves 5 police officers dead, 7 injured in Dallas." Quote, "It was just an endless stream of gunshots," unquote, one witness said. And like I said, who is that witness? This is just what they're telling us. Never believe a word mainstream media tells you, because we know darn well that not only do they lie and hire crisis actors in order to fulfill their agendas and in order to fulfill their propaganda to make you feel a certain way, what they also try to do is to get you revved up with law enforcement and to get you revved up with the police officers and local law enforcement in order to trigger a reaction. Remember, problem, reaction, solution. They're the ones who cause the problems by telling us all these things and feeding us this propaganda so that they can give us the reaction to hate one another and to cause the divide and conquer agenda in order to offer their own solution, which is the new world order, order out of chaos. You're going to see exactly what I'm talking about in just a second to come. Now, I'm here